Alright guys, welcome back to F1 News. 1 week from today, the Australian Grand Prix will be over and we will have a major indication as to whether it's possible for Mercedes to save their season. Confirmations today, they are planning to delay planned upgrades to their W15 this season because they simply don't understand whether the direction they're going in is actually going to make them any better. Lots of discussion today that Mercedes simply don't understand what is going wrong with their car, especially in Jeddah, but also at Bahrain, and that they need a McLaren-style upgrade from last season to turn their year around, but it's not like they have one in the works. Very much into your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. I greatly appreciate it. First of all, a couple of updates on the Horner stuff. We talked about this yesterday. Lots of new details on this. That the woman in question who made the complaint against Christian Horner, and obviously the allegations that have gone around now for a good couple of months or so, has also made an official complaint to the governing body, the FIA. The big drama about this really was the fact that Mohammed Ben Sulayem has seemingly said over the previous weeks they had received no such complaints, but apparently they did. And now a new one is being made public. The FIA commented on this and said that following at the FIA, inquiries and complaints are received and managed by the compliance officer and the ethics committee where appropriate. Both bodies operate autonomously, guaranteeing strict confidentiality throughout the process. As a consequence, and in general, we are unable to confirm the receipt of any specific complaint, and it is unlikely that we'll be able to provide further comment on the complaints that we may receive from any parties. So what do you guys think about this statement here from the FIA? Basically, they're saying this ethics committee part is a completely separate side of the business. We don't know what's going on over there. It seems like the implication is that obviously Ben Sulayem said they'd received no such complaints, but the rumour was that a whistleblower had told them about this right at the start of February and again at the start of March before now that complaint is becoming public because the BBC are reporting that it's happening. Is this their way of saying, well, I wasn't to know because that happened in this part of the business? But it's like, aren't you the president of the business? Surely you should know what's going on. And therefore they say, well, we can't comment on it. We can't even confirm we've received it because we don't know what's happening. I was like, is this organisation completely dysfunctional or just mostly dysfunctional? Like, what is the answer? It's one or the other as it stands. And we're relying on these guys to appropriately police Formula One from top to bottom with all the potential avenues that these teams can try and take to manipulate the rules and slide under this regulation. Like, there's no way I have any faith in the FIA to appropriately police this sport right now. And this is just one further example of exactly that. Motorsport, though, were also discussing the progress that certain teams have made this year and, of course, the decline that has happened for other teams. If you had to predict going into this season, which team would take the biggest step forward in terms of Constructors' Championship placings, I would have probably said the RB, the AlphaTauri, based on all the noise around that team going into the season. Now, you can argue that you look at the Red Bull this year, they might have made the biggest step of any team. Certainly, they're not far off, despite the fact that they're the best car. Ferrari have made a big step. Mercedes have made a step, apparently, but not much of one. We'll discuss that in a second. McLaren, from season to season, like as in from last year Bahrain and Jeddah to this year Bahrain and Jeddah, McLaren by far have made the most forward progress. But in terms of last year's championship position to this year's, I felt like the RB, the AlphaTauri, the Visa Cash App, whatever you want to say, was going to make the biggest step forward. We haven't really seen that. I think there was genuine concern. I don't think this is ever founded, really. But there was a feeling that we might go to Bahrain and it would be Verstappen, Perez, Tsunoda, Ricciardo, you know, because that RB, they were taking lots of parts in the RB19, as they have done, to be fair, and there was a feeling that, well, if they just rock up with an RB19 and Red Bull rock up with an RB20, it could be all over for the competition. Now, we haven't seen that in reality, right? It's not like Zak Brown's concerns are entirely unfounded as the benefit of having the B team. But I think there was more concern from McLaren that RB would actually be a serious threat this season. Like, I think there was a realistic, given what happened before the year, there was a realistic chance they could be mixing it up for, you know, fourth place in the Constructors. On the evidence we have so far, that's probably not going to happen. And Laura McKees, of course, former Ferrari man, now with RB, still annoys me, but whatever, says that, no, they're not doing anything wrong. It's 1,000% within the regulations, but I do have issues with their car, right? Ricciardo said they found a few flaws in that RB they need to resolve ASAP. And that's the problem for these guys as well. Tsunoda had a good start to last season, let's not forget. Had a load of those great P11 results. But the fact of the matter is, if the car isn't good enough to deliver consistent points, then you can put in stellar performances week in, week out, and you're going to get noticed. It's like, oh, well done, another P11. But if that was a P7 or P8, if the car was a bit better, that's like a serious... Well, you're making a serious name for yourself at that point, right? If Ollie Behrman debuted in the Haas and delivered an excellent performance on the weekends, he would get some credit. But he gets much more credit because the car he drove was better and he did a great job with it. Don't want to take anything away from Bearman. You guys have known that I've given a lot of positivity around Bearman for the last couple of years in this channel, really, if you guys have been watching that long. Of course, thanks to all those new guys who have come around over the last month or so, because things have been pretty crazy. But the reality is that you just make more of an impression when you drive a better car. And that is tough for Tsunoda. That's certainly tough for Ricciardo, right? Because I feel like if there's anyone on the grid, there's only so much you can do if you're driving a car that isn't that good. What you can do is beat your teammate. At the very minimum, that's what you can do. And Tsunoda, I feel bad that this guy hasn't, it doesn't look like he's going to get the call up to Red Bull. Maybe that should never have been expected, given the personality he is, the character he is, right? Has he matured that much? Maybe not on the evidence of what happened after the race in Bahrain. But still, Tsunoda came in last year, beat De Vries comfortably, beat Lawson while he was in the car, and beat Ricciardo last year. And this season, he's beating Ricciardo again. So what more does Yuki have to do? But Ricciardo needs to beat Tsunoda at every race for the next 5-6 races if he wants a chance, because there was lots of talk going into this year that if it was more competitive at the front of the field, and maybe Ferrari can get there, maybe McLaren can get there, maybe even Aston can get there. I don't know about Mercedes anymore, and we'll discuss why here in a second. But assuming that might have been the case, there was lots of talk that, well, Red Bull might need to consider getting rid of Perez, bringing Ricciardo in mid-season. That looks like an almost impossibility at the moment. And even RB boss McKees has said that an opportunity will arrive for Lawson. So the pressure is undoubtedly on Ricciardo to start delivering some decent performances. And if he doesn't, it's probably his last year in the sport, to be perfectly honest. But we've got to talk about Mercedes because they are also struggling in their own right. Toto Wolff made an interesting comment recently where he said that effectively Horner back in 2014-15 said Mercedes are dominating, the FIA should look to step in and resolve the situation. Toto says, well, I don't want to do that. I'm taking the moral high ground, and I will not be falling into that trap, but I will not be requesting the FIA to make regulation changes. Red Bull have just done the best job. But whatever you want to think about Toto's angle, the car clearly isn't up to scratch here. And Gary Anderson actually gave a very interesting analysis on what he feels like is going wrong with the W15 and why it doesn't seem like Mercedes have a clear idea of necessarily how to fix it. Bahrain looked pretty good. Their testing looked fine. They looked like they'd made a big step forward. We saw that in practice as well, but when qualifying came round, they slightly fell away from the pace. They do believe, I think, still Mercedes, they could well have had the second fastest car in Bahrain, but yet they didn't have the cooling necessary. And that was another big question that even they didn't understand at the time. It's funny, really, because Mercedes turned up to Jeddah thinking they had one very interesting question they couldn't work out the answer to. And now they have multiple, right? Because after Bahrain, they were like, we had all the data during the week of testing, during practice. We knew what the temperature was going to be during the Grand Prix. They raced the Grand Prix and they find the temperatures they expected to have in their engine were 1 to 2 degrees out from what they thought they would have, which is a big deal on that kind of, when you're talking on these type of levels. That's a big error to make in calculation. And all the talk was going into Jeddah, we don't know what happened there. We don't know why we didn't have the cooling we needed. That was costing the drivers, well, some sources say 4/10, some sources say 6 or 7/10 per lap. In terms of, sure, they have to lift and coast, they have to turn down the engine mode. That affects the tyre temperatures. It affects other things. They were losing lots of time, there's no doubt, in Bahrain because of this issue, but they didn't really know what was causing the problem that they had less cooling than they should have done. And while that was a major problem, they also now have to deal with arguably an even larger problem, certainly a larger problem, of actually just straight up car performance. So Lewis Hamilton was actually talking about this after the race and said that if you look at other teams such as the Red Bull, they have different concepts still to what the Mercedes is working with. And it's difficult to say how much Hamilton really understand, especially these ground effect regulations, and it's not Hamilton's job to design the car. That is on the team. He can of course give his feedback on what he feels like should be done, especially with which parts of the car he would like to see be strong. He wants a strong rear ends. It felt like the Mercedes had that in Bahrain. They definitely didn't have that in Jeddah. The question is as to why. What I find interesting here is once again the discussion around Mercedes, once again the discussion around their lack of correlation between the simulator and on track is coming down to the floor. Right at the start of the ground effect regulations, all the talk was about the floor, right? And probably for good reason. Then over the coming months and years, it's more shifted towards, well, suspension and ride height and these other factors and having a good platform for the car to build on, which is very true. But now the discussion, maybe after some degree of suspension development, is coming back to the floor, because at the end of the day, that is where so much downforce is generated, and it's a very complicated piece on these ground effect cars. It's not something that Mercedes simulations had to deal with, really, for the previous 8 years where they won all the titles. No ground effect in those eras. They didn't have to deal with the complications of the ground effect cars. I mean, okay, you drive fast. The Venturi tunnels generate the downforce that sucks the car to the ground, but of course you don't want the car getting sucked all the way to the ground, because then it's going to hit the ground, it's going to stall, it's going to bounce back up again. There's your porpoising, ladies and gentlemen. But you want it to stall at some point before it touches the ground. Just a very complicated thing to actually do. Some teams have worked out how to do it. Some teams worked it out immediately. Red Bull, for example. Some teams have, of course, still struggling with this. And Gary Anderson says that Hamilton has therefore been trying all sorts of setups to try and find a magic bullet to fix the problem effectively that will find half a second out of nowhere. They are clearly still experimenting with their car, but I don't think the solution and the performance leap from nowhere is in the car anymore. This is what we saw in Jeddah. They ran the first practice, they looked okay, and then they completely changed everything for second practice. They both ran very different setups, even during the Grand Prix to some extent. The team need to be realistic about their car and must wake up to the reality that they have a problem. In some ways, they are still fooling themselves, and this goes down to how they approach the weekends. Throughout Bahrain and Saudi, they have looked competitive in the early practice sessions before dropping back. Now, this is what George Russell said, that they look good early on, then they lose their way. So it's like, well, how do you lose your way, precisely, unless the other teams are simply not pushing hard enough early? That's Gary Anderson's read on this, is that they're running the car lighter on Friday to give themselves confidence. If this is actually true, I think that it's super damning on Mercedes that they're basically doing glory runs on the Thursdays and the Fridays in the practice sessions to kind of pretend that they're back type thing, or maybe G up some confidence in the team. And then the reality is the other teams show what they've got. Mercedes drop back to their true position. On raw pace alone in Jeddah, they were the 5th fastest team, 9th fastest, let's not forget, in Sector 1, or at least in the fast corners of Sector 1, which was not a great look at all. In the race, obviously, Russell was 40 seconds behind Verstappen. Hamilton was 46 seconds behind Verstappen. He didn't have the preferable strategy right, but the point was still there. And you've also got to consider that Verstappen was not pushing to the limit of himself nor to the car. The amount more performance in that car was, I don't know how much more performance the Red Bull has, but it's got to be pretty mesmerizing. I wonder how many cars Verstappen could lap if he really tried. I'd love to see them try. Maybe last race of the season, I don't know. Just go all out and see what the Red Bull is truly capable of, because I don't think we're seeing anything near the true performance. The only time you see it is when, let's say, Verstappen, when he had a bad pit stop back in Austin 2022, wasn't it? Then he actually had to push. And then you saw what the car was really capable of. And I think that that's still going to be a scary thing for the opposition. But yeah, nearly a second a lap in race trim off Verstappen, nearly a second a lap in qualifying trim as well. They must go back to doing the homework between races in a more effective way than just running their car light on fuel initially and then feeling like they're in a good place. They will not learn anything this way. It's just a deceptive and short-lived confidence boost. It's very damning indeed. So then it goes on to discuss in more detail really about why Mercedes don't have the car working properly or the correct philosophy still to understand how to get the car to lower to the ground without bouncing. They seem to be dealing with this reasonably well in Bahrain, but in Jeddah, again, the discussion in qualifying was the car was bouncing through some of the corners, causing them problems over the curbs, over the bumps, and it's a pretty smooth surface, to be fair, in Jeddah. It's going to be interesting when they get to Australia this upcoming weekend. And again, the loose rear end was becoming a problem. James Allison talked about that it was a spiteful rear end of last year's car that they had apparently resolved. Doesn't seem to be the case. Mercedes need to come up with a solution to achieve front end grip in the slower corners without sacrificing the rear end grip in the fast corners. Every comment they made suggests that they do not have this, that the car is constantly on a knife edge balance-wise. What Mercedes and Hamilton want is an upgrade like the McLaren had in 2023 that propelled them to be Red Bull's closest challengers in the second half of the season. McLaren showed a big jump is possible, but let's not forget, when McLaren made that jump, they said they were making a jump. They literally said when the season began, this car is terrible. In 6 races' time, we are bringing an actual proper car to the circuit. And that's what they said from the start. And that was concerning for McLaren fans initially, especially because the car was terrible, as they predicted at the start of the year. But then they brought the upgrade package, certainly in Austria and beyond, and then the McLaren was actually very competitive indeed. So they started the season poorly. They knew what they had to fix. They knew how to fix it. Mercedes are not in this position, right? They're not telling us, well, this is only the starting car. We've got our real car coming in a couple of races' time. They're saying, no, this car was meant to be a good base, and then we're bringing upgrades. Now, what do? And this is when they've discussed that they're designing experiments for Australia, and they're going to try some things out. Just like Hamilton was doing, let's not forget, in Australia 2 years ago, when he was basically the guinea pig running all sorts of sensors on his car to try and figure out what to do. And 24 months down the line, they still don't know what they're doing, it seems. Unless Jeddah was like a crazy outlier and they can figure out a reason why they weren't getting the high-speed performance they expected, it should be expected over the coming races issues with the W15 will continue. If they're struggling in the high corners, in the high-speed corners in Jeddah, they will struggle at some corner complexes in Australia, and certainly in Japan. Like, the Mercedes has not been good at Japan for the last couple of years. I can't imagine how bad this year's car is going to be in that Sector 1, when that's literally all it is, right? You absolutely need the confidence in the car and the high-speed performance. So Mercedes are now basically saying, yeah, we might have to postpone, at least it's rumoured, that they're looking to postpone their scheduled upgrades. This is just such a massive problem for the team. Red Bull, McLaren, Aston, all the top teams, Ferrari, they have scheduled upgrade plans. They will execute to those scheduled upgrade plans. Mercedes is saying, well, we have upgrades scheduled, but we don't really know if they're going to do what we want them to do because we have a new problem that we've managed to uncover, even though they said during the whole of practice that no, they'd solved the problems, now they just needed to add downforce. That does not seem so clear. So they will do a series of tests and checks in Melbourne to assess their performance, strength and shortcomings of the car, and then they will verify whether these upgrades will actually arrive to the car or whether they need to fix other things first. So yeah, for them to be struggling with this in year 3, I said it the other day, it's an embarrassment. It remains an embarrassment, and Lewis Hamilton will not be happy about the situation, obviously, but I think that, as Fernando Alonso says, 19 drivers started this season knowing that they weren't winning the World Championship. So it's about winning races, really, for most of the teams at this point. But I suppose for Hamilton, it's about just trying to achieve what he can in this final year at Mercedes before going to what definitely seem like the greener pastures as it stands of Ferrari, although I guess time will only tell on that one. It's also not just Mercedes that have their problems and their gripes with these generation of cars. Even Lando Norris made some interesting statements here discussing that he feels like the cars should be changed in 2026 so they're not as physically punishing. This is actually a key point that James Allison has said, that even Max Verstappen, look, his car is a rocket ship. You would think that he would love driving that car. It doesn't necessarily seem like that's the case. Just the way these cars are designed, very stiff suspensions, running very close to the ground. You're always going to have some degree of bouncing, even if your car doesn't like bounce because of the porpoising effect. It bounces because it hits the surface hard because the surface is uneven and the suspension is not active, and therefore it's really stiff. So I think that's something that the regulators might need to look at, that the cars are problematic in many ways. Mainly they're just too big and heavy, I think, is the fundamental thing that I would change about these cars. But there has been lots of talk about bringing back active suspension or something to this effect that would make the cars better to drive for the drivers and probably produce some better racing as well. But very much interested your thoughts on all this stuff in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.